Thanks for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Christina Evans. We are going to continue, as promised, with some of these top stories that we're following today, taking a live look there at the White House. So big news this week. The Supreme Court has officially cleared the way for the Trump administration to immediately end immigration protections that allowed roughly 350,000 Venezuelans living here in the United States to receive work permits and temporarily avoid deportation. Now it's official that those justices there on Monday granted an emergency appeal from the Trump administration as it seeks to rein in a federal program known as the temporary protected status. I want to bring into the conversation now immigration attorney Susham M. Thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. We've been talking about some of these Supreme Court decisions over the last few days, but let's start with the very basics. First of all, what is an emergency appeal and what legal route did we take to finally get to this point?
Yeah, an emergency appeal is something in slang called the shadow docket, which is an interesting name. But basically, it's a quick way to get to the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court accepts it, one justice, it's called a circuit justice, answers that appeal, and then they can decide on a limited issue. But they're not actually deciding on the underlying merits of the case. So, for example, they're not deciding on whether or not TPS could be effectively canceled. What they did decide on is that they're no longer going to keep the pause on those deportations, which is called injunction.
And as we're taking a look at some of this footage there, just of some of these Venezuelans who are marching for better protection rights here in the United States. Again, you mentioned something. The lower courts first had to address this. What led this to now going to the place where it was addressed finally by the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so just to take a step back, TPS, temporary protected status, was made first by Congress in 1990. And what it did was it safeguarded individuals that are going through horrible humanitarian conditions in their home country. So if they're already here and they don't want to be removed back to those. And the common examples are political strife, like dictatorships, political violence, or environmental strife. Think like earthquakes, for example. So we shouldn't return people temporarily, and that's why it's called temporary protected status. And to answer your question, Christina, about how this came up, well, the Biden administration in 2021 designated Venezuela as one of those countries because of what happened with the Maduro elections. A lot of countries have found him to be a dictator and overturned those elections and attacked political opposition. And so the Biden administration gave that protection in 2021 and then redesignated in 2023. Just recently, the Trump administration has tried to cancel that protection for Venezuelans, and that's where we headed to the district court first.
Makes sense. And so we're putting this up on folks' screen as well. This is from the New York Times. This is just their headline as they're covering this story as well. So we do know that under the program, Secretary of Homeland Security can allow immigrants from countries facing those humanitarian crises, like you mentioned, to remain there in the United States, live and work legally. What now happens to those Venezuelans who are currently here using this protected status? What is next for them?
Yeah, excellent question, Christina. Well, there's actually two designations. So there's the one from 2021 and there's a 2023 one. Now, the 2021, it's pretty clear that they're protected until September of this year. The 2023 designation is less clear. That's the one that was at the Supreme Court. And there's some arguments whether that ends imminently, like whether they could be removed quickly or not. Now, there is another case. So what the Supreme Court did is remand it back to the Ninth Circuit for a full decision. There was another case called the Ramos decision, in which case the Ninth Circuit, similarly on a different issue of TPS, said there at least needed to be a transition time, even if they were going to deny TPS. So on the other end of it, though, in terms of people that are going through the middle of this, and again, Venezuela, I think, most people can agree, is actually in worse conditions than it was before. So very odd to cancel it now. But individuals who are from Venezuela, they may want to immediately look at other paths that they could qualify for. So for example, I used to teach asylum refugee law. That is where someone is afraid to go back to their home country. because they may get persecuted based on certain grounds. One ground we see a lot of cases from Venezuela is political asylum. So if they're afraid to go back because of their political activities, they should consult an attorney and see if they qualify for applying for asylum as a way to try to stay here and be protected while that application is pending.
All right, we do want to continue on as well here, taking another look there at some of this footage we have there of the Supreme Court. We also know that Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson dissented from the High Court's decision. Also, though, without an explanation. Is this common? Is there a reason, though, that she didn't make a formal decision on paper, letting us know why she chose to dissent?
Yes, Christina, it is common in this sort of emergency appeal, as we talked about before. And the reason that's common is these emergency appeals are not deciding the underlying case of whether TPS was properly canceled or not. What they're just deciding is whether the hold, the injunction by the district court to not be able to deport them, that's the limited issue that they're deciding. And so with that limited issue on that emergency appeal or shadow docket, it's very, very common. In fact, that's the standard, is that they don't issue an underlying decision. I think one of the reasons why the Supreme Court has always done that is because they don't want to influence the lower courts, like the Ninth Circuit, on deciding the actual issues themselves before it goes back up to the Supreme Court of whether or not the Trump administration correctly canceled it here.
And taking a live look there at the White House, I do want to read out a quote that we have here. These are from some of the experts who have been weighing in on the Supreme Court ruling. Them saying that this is the largest single action stripping of any group of non-citizens of immigration status in modern U.S. history. I know you also choose to be a professor of law as well, so well versed here in some of the history of our country. What are your thoughts when you hear that statement? Is it something that resonates with you? Would you agree?
Yes, I do agree. I mean, we're looking at about 350,000 Venezuelans that could be put in jeopardy here. That's not including another 250,000 on a different parole issue. So about 600,000 individuals. And if we look at Venezuela, I mean, even just the Department of State, Country Conditions Report, Amnesty International, Human Rights First, I mean, there are political killings going on, torture, detention, and then even outside of that, hyperinflation, blackouts, starvation. So, it's quite surprising or appalling that we're thinking about sending back so many hundreds of thousands of individuals under that scenario. On the other side of it, I don't want to just be all gloom and doom. I mean, people do have certain rights. So the Ninth Circuit hasn't ruled on the underlying case. Again, if an individual qualifies or thinks they qualify for asylum, I would highly recommend doing a consultation. That's a class, again, I taught was asylum refugee law.
All right. Well, since we have you here on the line, my last question for you. Obviously, I don't want folks to take this as their only legal advice, but you said seek an attorney. What things should those folks, if they are Venezuelans, they believe that they have this temporary status, what steps or questions should they truly be asking any potential attorney or person who could be their legal counsel?
Yeah, I mean, number one, they should see if they're under the designation of the 2021 or the 2023. Like I said, the 2023 might be quite imminent, so that they want to really look at an immigration attorney as soon as possible. The earlier one actually doesn't have a whole lot more time. It's until September as of now. That's number one. Number two, I would say if they're afraid to go back because they may get persecuted. We've seen personally at our law firm a lot of Venezuelan consultations and cases about political asylum. So if they think they'll be tortured, killed, persecuted, if they get returned to Venezuela because of their political opinion or other reasons, then they should consult with an attorney, see if they qualify. Under the Refugee Act of 1980, if they apply, they should not be removed from the United States while that application is pending. So that's a second version. Third, there may be other paths available to them as well. So, if they had a valid entry and they're married to a U.S. citizen, each case is different. But we see cases where people had relief, but they just never applied because they didn't need to. They had this employment authorization and status. It's temporary protected status. But now they really need to look into it. The time is against them. And so they really need to look into whether they qualify for these other avenues of relief.
All right. Certainly appreciate attorney Susham M here helping us to break down the very latest with the Modi law firm. Any final thoughts before I let you go?
Yeah, I mean, the final thought I would say is in terms of the underlying case, it's a bit surprising because whenever it can be canceled, I mean, first, usually what the government does, they allow it to just expire. But it's only been, I think, the Trump administration, including the first administration, that's ever tried to cancel it in the middle of its designation. So that's unprecedented. But even when that happens, you have to see like a change or an improvement of country conditions. Think here it's actually gotten worse. Venezuela has gotten worse from almost every aspect, whether it's economic conditions or torture or political killings. So it's a bit surprising to see this move. At the same time, people do have other rights and other avenues, and that's why it's an honor to be here again with you. And I hope to help the audience and the public more in the future. And I hope you have a good day.
All right, we certainly appreciate with the Modi Law Group, Susham Modi, helping us to break down the very latest. We appreciate your time as always.
Thank you.